Thank you very much. So now I take this opportunity to welcome Madam Lydia, is a project head MTCC Africa. In her opening remark, she will have her own remarks, and also at the same time convey the remarks from VCJKUAT, Professor Victoria Ngumi. Welcome, Madam Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Lydia Ngugi. I am the head of MTCC Africa. I will proceed to give you a brief overview of some of the activities that MTCC Africa looks into, as well as putting into consideration the elements of the global MTCC Africa network. First and foremost, it's very important for us to familiarize ourselves with the context of this meeting that we are having. The aim of the meeting is to ensure that the shipping elements that reduce the greenhouse gas emissions are put into consideration. As you can see in the diagram above, there is levels of ambition that need to be put into focus up until the year 2050. And some of these projections have to ensure that there is not undergoing business as usual, but then at the same time, the industry needs to work towards looking at the policy and legal aspects implementation at a global and regional level. How is this done? There was the adoption of the initial IMO GHG strategy. The initial IMO GHG strategy is backing up to the MARPOL Annex VI that looks at the level of ambitions that need to be put into consideration while implementing and applying the MARPOL conventions that essentially look into the mitigation of climate change from the shipping and maritime industry by putting into place adoption measures that are of benefit to the entire globe, and most importantly, the African region that MTCC Africa puts into consideration. There is a wide factor of shipping elements that need to be considered as we look into this effect. Most of them include elements of design, operation, and economic solutions. Some of the elements of design, operation, and economic solutions have been highlighted through the percentages that you have seen in the demonstration above. The main aim in achieving the goals of the initial IMO GHG strategy is to ensure that there is a mix of the operational technical measures and the innovative solutions. You will note that given the overview that we had earlier on, MTCC Africa does also have in place pilot projects that are applicable to ships and ports, looking at the reduction potential measures, and we shall delve deeper into this when we have the further demonstrations in this meeting. How is this done? Since the adoption of the initial IMO GHG strategy, the International Maritime Organization has had a variety of initiatives that put this into perspective. Coming closer home, and what puts into perspective the MTCC Africa is the global MTCC's network. This ensures that no one is left behind. In the African region, this is through the MTCC Africa. We mainly look at the importance of technical cooperations and also focus on the specific challenges that the SEEDs and LDCs need to put into consideration while factoring in elements of mitigation of climate change in the shipping and maritime industry. The Global MTCC Network project is funded by the European Union and implemented by the International Maritime Organization. It is a network of 5 maritime technology cooperation centers established in Africa, Asia, Caribbean, Latin America, and the Pacific, respectively. The GMN concept is looking towards being a more sustainable approach. For example, there is the element of having the host institutions creating themselves as a center of excellence by virtue of being centers of excellence. In MTCC Africa, We work very closely with our board of directors. The chair of our board is Madam Nancy Karigithu, and the co-chair of the board is the vice chancellor of the university, J.K. Watt University. Madam Nancy Karigithu is the principal secretary, State Department for Maritime and Shipping Affairs, and she will be giving her remarks later on in the webinar. In addition to this, we also work very closely with the Department of Marine Engineering at the university, that is the brainchild of the MTCC Africa, given we have expertise in the relevant departments. MTCC Africa also works very closely with the consortium members. We have representation from the Kenya Maritime Authority experts, as well as the Kenya Ports Authority experts. And in all this, we ensure that we serve the entire African region to promote climate change mitigation in the shipping and maritime industry. As we put this into consideration, MTCC Africa, among other things, has been conducting pilot projects. We have completed initial pilot projects 1 and 2 that gave us the recommendation of having the third pilot project, which is looking into the port emission reduction measures. And this is one of the pilot projects similar to what the Caribbean MTCC Africa is looking into. What are some of the impacts of the pilot projects that MTCC Africa has been looking into? First and foremost, MTCC Africa, through the experts, has been able to identify baselines of emissions at the Port of Mombasa. In addition to this, we have been able to partner with the Port of Douala in conducting Tier 2 level energy audits. Lastly, MTCC Africa, working very closely with the Kenya Ports Authority, has had the advantage of encouraging and ensuring that there is 60% energy saving at the Port of Mombasa. Through the impact of the pilot projects, we also have elements of capacity building. Given that we are going through our Given that we are going through a pandemic, MTCC Africa is having virtual activities to ensure that we do still build capacity in the region relevant to our mandate. How do we do this? MTCC Africa has a very strong regional focal point partners. The focal point partners are drawn from the respective geography of the African continent. We do have representation from the East African side of the continent of Africa. We have representation from West Africa. We have representation from North Africa and Southern Africa as well. As you can see, we look at this from the ocean space, and this gives us a very interesting demonstration of countries, given that most countries are IMO member states and looking forward and progressing towards the implementation of the initial IMO GHG strategy as a policy document that is backing up MARPOL Annex VI convention. And that is some of the roles that MTCC Africa is looking into in the regional perspective to promote sustainable shipping. And that is the end of my overview. I also welcome you to follow us on our social media pages. These have been highlighted above, and I look forward to a progressive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Lydia, for such a very elaborate overview. So next, I take this opportunity to welcome Madam Nancy Karigithu to give her welcoming address. She's the Principal Secretary, Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure, Housing, Urban Development and Public Works, and State Development for Ship and Maritime Affairs. She's also the board chair of MTCC Africa. Welcome, Madam Nancy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Odhiambo and Lydia. Thanks for that very beautiful presentation. Let me start by acknowledging our host for today. That is the Maritime Technology Cooperation Center for Africa, MTCC Africa. Thank you so much for this hostship. Then Mr. Ivane Abashidze, Deputy Director, Maritime Transport Agency of Georgia Batumi, and Vice Chair of the International Maritime Organization Legal Committee, and congratulations for that feat of winning the elections to this prestigious position. Ms. Taraisa Ada Alogo, Senior Policy Officer from the Infrastructure and Energy Department of the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. Thank you so much, Madam. Ms. Raisa, for graciously accepting to be with us today. Dr. Hiram Derito, MTCC Africa Project Director, Ms. Lydia Ngugi, MTCC Africa Head, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to start by wishing you all a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your respective jurisdiction. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this meeting on the policy and legal aspects in the African region on the implementation of Annex IV to the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, also known as MARPOL. MTCC Africa is part of the global MTCC network, also known as GMN, which is an initiative funded by the European Union and implemented by the IMO Department of Partnerships and Projects. As the Principal Secretary in charge of Shipping and Maritime, I'm very proud and honored to chair the steering committee for MTCC Africa. On behalf of the government of Kenya and the MTCC Africa, allow me to start by expressing our sincere gratitude to the European Union for the unwavering support EU has provided in the funding for this very important initiative, as well as the financial support in establishing the MTCC Africa. I also wish to acknowledge and extend sincere appreciation and thanks to the International Maritime Organization for the continued technical guidance that the organization has so generously extended towards the implementation of this project to date. Ladies and gentlemen, this interactive meeting will help highlight practical information on the technical and legal implications of ratifying, implementing, and enforcing MARPOL Annex VI. International shipping steers the carriage of over 80% of all goods by volume, and by so doing, it plays a very crucial role in promoting economic and social development of countries because it is a source of employment for one, and also provides access to essential goods. This notwithstanding, international shipping, of course, by dint of its nature, occasions negative externalities which are harmful to the environment and human health. An externality of key concern, of course, is air emissions that are released from the combustion of fossil fuels. The emissions are composed of both air pollutants and greenhouse gases. Air pollutants occasion acid rain, respiratory diseases, and also reduced life expectancy. Greenhouse gases occasion climate change as well. In the last century, there has been a rise in carbon dioxide levels across the globe, and this has reversed food patterns, occasioned adverse weather conditions, wildfires, sea levels rise, and ocean coral bleaching, among many other deleterious effects. So, ladies and gentlemen, Annex VI was developed due to the growing worldwide concerns to control air pollution and was added to MARPOL in 1997 upon the adoption of a protocol to amend that convention. It entered into force on 19th May 2005 and at present has 101 contracting states representing 96.75% of world tonnage. MARPOL Annex VI addresses air pollution in shipping by regulating various emissions, including ozone depleting substances, nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, and greenhouse gas emissions. The regulations limit discharges into the atmosphere of nitrogen oxide from diesel engines, sulfur oxide from the combustion of fuel oils, and volatile organic compounds from tanker cargoes. Deliberate discharge of ozone depleting substances is prohibited. New installations containing ozone depleting substances are also prohibited, on all ships. And also new installations containing ozone substances will be prohibited on all ships. The regulations address greenhouse gas emissions by providing technical and operational approaches to enhance energy efficiency of ships. The regulations encourage state parties to promote availability of compliant fuel oils, as well as provide port reception facilities. Ladies and gentlemen, the African region has shown great commitment to address climate change in the maritime and shipping industry. The 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy, also known as 2050 AIM Strategy, recognizes natural disasters, marine environmental degradation, and climate change as threats and vulnerabilities in Africa's maritime domain. The strategy encourages African states to ratify, domesticate, and implement international legal instruments on that topic. Africa's Agenda 2063 recognizes marine resources, energy, and port operations, as well as maritime transport, as priority areas towards the attainment of the aspirations of a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. At present, sadly, only 16 African states have ratified MARPOL Annex VI. It is my hope that this meeting will encourage more ratification and effective implementation of the convention for those members that have already ratified. We must encourage all members to come on board, because we can't afford to leave anyone behind, based on the fact that climate change knows no boundaries in terms of continents or states, and therefore we must all work together. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to once more thank MTCC Africa for organizing and hosting this interactive meeting, and also take this opportunity to wish you all very fruitful deliberations. Thank you all for your attention. May God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for that wonderful remarks. Now we want to go to the presentations. Our first presenter will be Mr. Ivane Abatshide, the Deputy Director, Maritime Transport Agency of Georgia, Batumi, Vice Chair of the International Maritime Organization Legal Committee. Welcome, Mr. Ivane.
Thank you. Thank you for presenting me, and thank you for MTCC Africa for having me here. I'm very glad to see my dear friends and colleagues from Kenya as hosts of this meeting. Ms. Nancy Karegetu, whose wisdom is always a guiding hand at IMO. She's been a long-standing chair of IMO's Technical Cooperation Committee, where we supported very much her activities. And she, after her term, let's say the legacy within the organization remains, not only there, not only at IMO, but also in related organizations such as IMSO, where vocal support to international rule-based order is one of the core activities of your government, Ms. Karegetu, where we always support and applaud such approach, because our countries like ours, developing countries, emerging maritime countries, always need a multilateral approach towards having an influence over the decision-making process on international fora, and therefore we always support the initiatives of your government. So my greetings to you, to everyone. I'm also extremely happy that my dear colleague and my friend, we studied together, Lydia Ngugi, has invited also me to attend this meeting and to give you a short presentation about the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI international legislation, which can sometimes turn to be a tricky business. But to put in a nutshell, after the wise words of Ms. Karigitu and the presentation of Ms. Lydia, I can only add that at the time when 1997 protocol for the MARPOL Annex VI was adopted, it was a first step towards the regulation of air emissions from ships and in the shipping sector. And the instrument has been well in advance put in place by International Maritime Organization, well in advance to Paris Agreement on climate change. And more concrete actions and more concrete regulations are in this convention. What we have to say from the outset is that regardless of the fact that the Paris Agreement did not list the shipping as a direct contributor to the climate change, the IMO has gone further. And some may accuse us at the IMO of overregulating the sector, but we don't see any other way forward other than to reduce the emissions to meet the deadlines from 2050, because changing the perception about the climate change and its effects, adverse effects, which we see on a daily basis worldwide, really needs a common approach to stand together and to change the perception of each and everyone. Otherwise, regardless of the industry impact, we would not, or we will not achieve rather an impact. Therefore, MARPOL Annex VI, regardless of the fact is not yet a mandatory instrument under the IMO conventions, it's going to be so very soon because of its worldwide acceptance. And since Ms. Karigitu has widely touched the points about the MARPOL Annex VI and its history and its importance, I would also stress that legal implementation of MARPOL Annex VI is one of the most challenging parts of the convention, because domestication of the convention cannot go without having an effective implementation mechanisms in place. Appropriate rule, appropriate law has to be, and the level of legislation has to be established at first, after we ratify the convention, to be binding upon all the parties that are involved in the activities under the MARPOL Annex VI. MARPOL Annex VI has obviously is affecting us in every term, in the shipping especially. And what we can say is that when we design the legislation under the MARPOL Annex VI, we always look at the broader understanding, what the MARPOL Annex VI is regulating. And obviously, it should regulate the air pollutions from ships while in ports and on board the ships flying the flag of particular party, regardless where they are. Of course, the ramifications and the complications of the convention and the requirements on the compliant fuels has been one of the key issues here, one of the issues that had been a challenging issue for the industry. Therefore, the compliant fuels availability is one of the key cornerstones when we ratify the convention, to make it available, to make it accessible to the industry. Of course, there are various methods to achieve the compliance with the requirements of the MARPOL Annex VI, but there are, of course, the methods that are more expensive and methods that are less expensive. Of course, when we talk about the compliant fuels, we talk about the low sulfur oils, which has a lower impact on the atmosphere around us. And of course, when we talk about the alternative methods on the existing ships, the IMO designed can be the scrubbers that are designed in a way that it filters the existing heavy fuels with the excessive sulfur limits, with of course lower amounts while emitted in the air. Of course, when we implement, we always define a scope. So the scope when we define is always about the air pollution from ships while in ports, and obviously by ships of each particular country, which is a ratifying member state, wherever it is, regardless of its location. Of course, the convention defines its emissions controls areas, and on these ECAs, so-called ECAs, there are stricter or more stringent control over the pollutions and its enforcement. Of course, we need to then, within the legislation, define the terms. And one of the terms that is, one examples that is brought to your attention on the presentation screen is, of course, for example, what is a major conversion and what is the major conversion for a ship means. I will not touch each particular point because it won't be necessary for us to explain each and every detail. We will go beyond the 25 minutes limit of this presentation, but we have to obviously talk about what are the ships on which the regulations of the MARPOL Annex VI are applicable, and what the convention says it's applicable to all ships except where expressly stated otherwise. So the domestication principle, the implementation principle under the MARPOL Annex VI will always be based on the convention and on the principle that's identified in the convention. And for example, that these regulations is an example on your screen, that these regulations shall not apply to any emission necessary for the purpose of securing the safety of ship or saving the life at sea. These are the instances where we can always look at the exceptions that can be provided. Or, for example, when an emission is a result of the damage of a ship, when the repair process is ongoing, this is something that is naturally taken out from the application of the convention. And we cannot accept, and this is a very particular, very interesting point under the convention, that we cannot accept an application of the convention from the situation when we determine that the owner is negligent on obviously not making a proper precautions to preempt, to prevent the particular extent. What we have to always look into when we implement this convention or any IMO convention, we have to look into the larger picture. When we talk about the MARPOL Annex VI, we always have the SOLAS next to it. When we talk about the SOLAS, we always have a cold reg next to it. And when we have a cold reg, we have a tonnage convention next to it, and etc., etc. And obviously an overarching for the human element is an STCW convention. Therefore, when we talk about the MARPOL Annex VI and this particular element, this can be envisaged under the ISM regulations, International Ship Management regulations that are under the ISM code, envisaged under there for the particular responsibility part of the owner. So the legislation shall ideally cover, the implementing legislation shall ideally cover both aspects, the MARPOL Annex VI aspect for the exceptions, but how the exceptions are regulated and when the exceptions are not applied, what are those exceptions are regulated, for example, in this case, on the negligence of the owner by the ISM legislation. Of course, then we have to define what are the exemptions, and convention also gives us a direct access to these exceptions. And after defining who is a responsible authority in a country, which is normally a maritime administration of each and particular country, then we have to talk about the exemptions which can be made. So those are different from the exceptions that we made under the definition. So the exemptions that we can make from a specific provisions of the conventions, and these exemptions are always case by case or defined by the convention. And when we talk about this particular subject, it is important that we define in the legislation the tools for issuing an exemption. Of course, while we are talking about the implementing of convention, it is a very important aspect that we talk about the equivalence as well. Those equipment that we have on board are always type approved, which means that particular equipment that is used on board is manufactured and approved by type. This can be the classification society or a flag state recognized, or a classification society recognized by the flag state, or there can be a common rule approved by the IMO. Therefore, we have to be very careful when we are accepting any equivalents under our legislation, and equivalents are subject to communication to International Maritime Organization, where we have to always look at the situation when we see what particular situation has an equivalency structure. We have to communicate this, because this can be something good for the international maritime community. So the alternative solution for the particular equipment. Of course, one of the most important functions that is vested in the maritime administration is how you verify that everything according to the convention is respected, and there the most crucial point is surveys. Since we are talking about the legal implementation of this particular convention, from the outset I had to say, but I will add now, since we are not too late, there are of course very particular, very technical aspects of the convention which are highly scientific, and those particular aspects we as lawyers will always need to consult a particular expert or a technical assistant who can always give us an advice on how to implement particular part of the convention, which is a very scientific in nature. So when we talk about the surveys, this is part of that particular exercise. Under the convention, every ship of 400 gross tonnage and above, and every fixed and floating drilling rigs and other platforms shall be subject to the following surveys. So we have the threshold, which is 400 gross tons. But what happens for the ships which are below 400 threshold? If below 400 threshold, we have to always consider that as the other MARPOL annexes OFA, we have to define our own rules. For example, the similar approach is in the under MARPOL Annex 2, MARPOL Annex 2, MARPOL Annex 1. We have to define where, if our limit is 400, what is the acceptable regulation for the ships which are below 400. So we cannot have a legislation which regulates the only conventional requirements. Convention requires that we have to regulate the this particular aspect as well. Of course, one of the most particular parts of the conventions, when we talk about the port state control and the enforcement of the convention, is the certification of each and particular ship, and this is of course IAPP certificate, International Air Pollution Prevention Certificate, which gives us a attestation, a certification proof that particular ship is certified, and those are for all the ships which are more than 400. Those are conventional certificates applicable, and all platforms and drills engaged in voyages to waters under the sovereignty or jurisdiction of other parties to the convention. So it's beyond your shores. So IAPP certificates are proof that this particular ship complies with the MARPOL Annex VI requirements. Of course, energy efficiency is something very important tool under the IMO convention. So we have to implement this is a very tricky business to implement the energy efficiency part of the convention, because there are certain tools that you can incentivize within a green approach to the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI in your local legislation, such as cold ironing, or which means that shore electricity supply to ships, or any other related applicable legislation or mode which can be also beneficial for the country, so it will get more income rather than having a ship emitting more pollution on its shore. of course, energy efficiency is based, and the MARPOL Annex VI is based on on the prohibition of ozone depleting good substances, and ODS, so-called, which are of course important to define that their deliberate emissions are forbidden. So the enforcement part and the deliberate emissions part shall be effectively administered by the party to the convention. So there should be an enforcement function in this regard. I discussed the fuel oil availability, which has been a crucial since the beginning of the since the new amendments on the low sulfur oils entered. And fuel oil availability is something that is an exercise still for a lot of countries and for a lot of regions. But as I said, there are an alternative ways of achieving the compliance, such as accepting a fuel oil, but also to have an approach installing the scrubbers that will filter your emissions. How we control that actual delivery has been performed. We always talk about the bunker delivery notes, and bunker delivery notes are the documents which shall be retained for at least period of 3 years after the fuel oil has been delivered on board. So it means that your compliance has to create a history, and all particular ships under each flag state has to be required to be compliant with this particular notion under the convention. Energy efficiency, I have touched in an earlier discussion, but of course, energy efficiency, we have not just a general approach, but concrete approach. What is an energy efficiency design index for particular new build ships, and what is the required and attained EEDI to differentiate between them. Attained EEDI is the EEDI, so energy efficiency design index is the EEDI value achieved by the individual ship, which means that any flag state or a flag state can incentivize using EEDI. For example, the low steaming, for example, any other particular parts of the energy efficiency tools that particular ship is using. So there can be an incentive tools for totally green ships, for compliant ships, for ships that are most efficiently using their energy efficiency methods. And of course, under the convention, when we talk about the mandatory instruments, we said that verification is of compliance by the state is carried out under the International Maritime Organization audit scheme, where the member states are audited by the IMO auditors. And if you become the party of MARPOL Annex VI, the audit requirement has to go down in the particular legislation which is implementing your ratification process. And of course, we have to take into consideration that since this project MTCC network is financed by the European Commission approach or European Union approach towards any convention that we talk about in an environment is always a polluter pays principle. And why the polluter pays principle? Because you have to realize that if you are polluting, you are paying an appropriate tax. For example, when we travel into European Union by air, we always pay the air pollution tax. And it is part of our ticket, price of our ticket that we pay. So, for example, I decided to bring to you the polluter pays principle implementation example from Georgia, which can also be beneficial for countries. So the countries can benefit from having access to sea and having ports, which means that additional fees can be collected on the environmental pollution impact scheme, which is absolutely acceptable legal solution. And the countries which are busy inventing this or that type of fee for charging the ships, may not use an invented tools, but may impose a fee which can be directly beneficial under the remit of environmental pollution impact. In Georgia, all ships that come to Georgian ports are charged for these fees, for the emissions, for any pollution that they possibly make. And of course, here the key is that the fee principle has to be transparent, has to be, of course, differentiated on different types of ships. And there are the different ways to achieve it. I brought you an example from Georgia, which, for example, gives you the approach of identification of dedicated formula, which would calculate this or that fee for the particular ship, for ships which are, for example, more than 1,000 gross tons up to 5,000, then from 5,000 to 15,000. And this particular approach is perfectly legal. And we are always looking at an implementation as a tool for bringing more money to your economy, more money to your economy, more transparent money to your economy, which is an implementation of, as I said, Poulter pays principle. And of course, there are different ways of achieving energy efficiency of our ports and the reduction of pollution. While we do the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI, we might need to do 3 different steps. One is the rapid assessment of emissions in port sector. The another is to create a policy document. What would you require, and what is your aim of implementation of MARPOL Annex VI, and implementing legislation, which we just touched upon, the very basic parts of it. I could give you an example of one of the largest Georgian ports, where we had a closure of port due to bad weather conditions, approximately 96 days. And this particular aspect of nature was heavily affecting the port's operations. And our, let's say, the approach towards the weather conditions have been problematic, because 96 days is a problem for the business as well. So what we did was that we approached the port and agreed on an investment plan, which allowed us to take and to distribute the risks between the parties, which means then we upgraded the tugs, we upgraded the pilot boat, we upgraded the entry limits for the entrance channel. And from 96 days, we went down to 15 days. 15 days. And we allowed the port to operate on factual weather conditions, which cut the 70% of emissions from port. 70% of emissions from this particular port in Georgia, plus, as I said, added to the economy of the region where the port is located. So this is in a nutshell what I wanted to tell you about the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI. I'm all ears if you have any questions to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ivane. We have our first question from Spencer Ogot. There's one that is on the chat, but I believe that Madam Lydia, since it's a regional question, you will tackle it. The question by Andres Moreno. But you can start with Spencer Ogot can go on the first question.
I've seen Somalia has, it's a question from Somalia. It has recently exceeded MARPOL Annex 1 and 2, not 6. What are your view that transposition, domestication, minimum needs? That one can I answer, right?
Go ahead.
The point is that you cannot ratify the MARPOL Convention without ratification of Annexes 1 and 2. Because they form the integral part of the convention. Minimum requirements for that are set out in the for the implementation are set out in the convention. Obviously, the implementing legislation is better for the industry. And minimum requirements for that would be from your side, the certification requirements, the collection of reception facilities requirements, because the reception facilities are a good point, but reception facilities legislation is also a tricky one to achieve. The reception facilities are not something that we imagine as sophisticated technological processes. For example, under MARPOL Annex V, which is the garbage, a domestic, let's say the residues, the garbage, so to say, we can have a city a garbage collection infrastructure incorporated into the port system. And the city can take the garbage from. Of course, if you do the differentiation of different types of garbage, for example, under MARPOL Annex V, that's just one example. Of course, for 1 and 2, you always need to have a collection barges that are required. So what we do is that if you have something similar to harbor rules or port rules, for your ports part, the implementation should be done there in the port rules, the harbor rules, which is a minimum technical requirement for port. And for the other part, for the flag state part, in the flag state legislation, wherever it is regulated, regulating a certification requirements for ships. It might be different levels of acts. I'm not aware of internal legislation of Somalia on this particular aspect.
Thank you very much. I will request Spencer Bosch to ask her question.
I've seen there is a question about polluter pay principle. Yes, it affects, but it has to be fair. What I say is that nobody likes to have more money to be paid. But what I'm saying is that the polluter pays principle is something that is very logical to impose. When you have a look in your or port fees, for example, in Georgia, we had a lot of non-transparent fees. We did not know what they were about or why they were collected, you see? And I'm sure this will be the case in most of the countries, because there has been traditionally for that particular aspect or the for watchman fees, for example, under the ISPS, or for we had one absurd fee which was about the environmental monitoring fee which was collected by the port, and it was not doing anything about that. So it did not have any administrative nor physical infrastructure to collect the fee. So if you make the fee transparent and accessible and understandable for the industry, the polluter pays principle is accepted worldwide. And I believe that that particular fee can be utilized successfully.
Thank you very much. I believe that the rest of the questions can be handled later. We can now welcome the second presenter, Ms. Raisa Ada Alogo, Senior Policy Officer, the Infrastructure and Energy Department, Africa Union Commission, Addis Ababa. Welcome.
Can you listen to me? Hello?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can hear. You can put it in presentation mode.
Oh, okay, this is what I'm doing. Sorry for...
It's okay.
It's okay. My laptop is a bit slow, but it will be fixed. Sorry, it's taking this time. Okay, but first of all, let me thank MTCC Africa for inviting the African Union Commission for this very, very important meeting discussion on policy and legal aspects in the African region. And particularly, I really want to extend my gratitude on behalf of the acting director, Mr. Atef Marzu, who will not be able to join the meeting. So I will make this presentation on his behalf. Thank you to Madam Nancy for inviting the African Union Commission. It has been a very long time. And once again, thank you to MTCC, because we have been exchanging for a very long time to see how we can collaborate. And this is the Africa we want. And I'm very glad to see that there is so much progress regarding issues for alternative solutions in our continent. Let me refer to the last presentation, which was more on legal aspect for the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI. I will not focus on legal aspect because I'm not a legal expert. I will precisely present on how the African Union Commission will support the joint activities or mutual collaboration in terms of implementing alternative solutions for the continent. We all know that since COVID-19 was declared global pandemic, things have completely changed. And probably this is the right time we have today to see how we can rebuild, how we can rethink our transport system in the continent. How can we achieve sustainable alternative? How can we fix the issue of alternative solution for the shipping industry and port in our continent? My presentation will especially focus on transport sector emission in the continent, global marine traffic, how maritime industry contribute to CO2 emission, climate change effect, IMO convention ratification, and as a way forward, what will be the perspective for the African Union Commission? As I explained from the beginning, our role as a political leader is to support and to promote alternative solutions for the continent. But we all know that shipping industry is a major global for all activity. Our continent is fully connected today because we have this shipping industry with huge port, which oceans, which seas, which can be facilitate the trade into the African trade area. In April 2018, the International Maritime Organization agreed to reduce emission by at least 50 by 2050. This is a very huge decision. And now how it can be made through our nation, through our estimate member states. Before giving any optimistic or realistic response, let's go back to the transport sector CO2 emissions. It was amazing when I was looking on those specific data regarding transport emissions in the continent, not only in the continent, for all the world roads. We just realized that the road sector itself, it's responsible for more than 45% of transport emission. Apart of that, when you look at the shipping sector, we are contributing for 10.6%, which means that we are not fully responsible for those emissions. But in reality, we have the responsibility to take the decision to put in place specific measures on how we can prevent our seas and oceans in our continent. So for more explanation, I added in my presentation how we can find all those specific analytic data. In the meantime, in 2020, recently, I look at the recent data coming from AUA, I just realized that when we compare the global transport emission, we have the same reality. Aviation and shipping industry, they're having almost the same analysis, but at least we have to be aware that transportation is still responsible for 24% of direct emission from fuel combustion, road vehicles, car, and trucks. So I was impressed to present this specific data regarding the fact that we are focusing on shipping, of course, but we have to make the analysis through other specific subsectors to have an idea how we can progress on this specific issue, which is our reality. We are depending on shipping, Let's remember during the period of COVID-19, when all the member states were locked down, all the borders were locked down, but the demand on health of our equipment was finding response from shipping authorities. The focus on the presentation was to specifically present on how climate change has a huge problem in our continent. Maybe you can ask me why I want to present the global marine traffic. Let's look at around the continent and let's see how this satellite shows specifically how the route along the continent itself contribute to the climate change situation we are facing today. It's a reality. We are depending definitely to the shipping, to the cargo, to the vessels, but all the mode of transport on maritime industry. So definitely global marine traffic has an effect important to the shipping, to the climate change. This week is a specific week. Since last week, we are having several meetings on Africa Climate Week. And all the stakeholders, all the decision makers, they are fully understand the need to progress on the issue of climate change. I'm currently in France, actually. Normally at this season, it's supposed to be very, very hot. But we just realized that the season also have completely changed, which means that climate change is a huge and very important challenge for not only for the African continent, but for all the whole world, which means that we cannot, as Africans, be left behind the big decision. We have to be part of the coalition, because definitely, if tomorrow a decision will come up to see how to fight, how to mitigate the climate change, our continent has to be part of it. That's why this presentation is just a demonstration on where we are today, and also to think how we can fight the future, how we can protect our oceans, and particularly how we can protect the shipping industry in Africa. I have focused to the same image for the climate change, how climate change affects the shipping industry. I was reading one article posted recently regarding one port in Mauritania, and we just realized that in Mauritania, you can find a lot of vessels which are damaged, which means that the climate change has a direct effect on the shipping industry. And we have to think how we can protect our infrastructure, because regarding beyond this situation, there is a loss in terms of financial situation. IMO convention, this is where we are today. And I really want to thank our colleagues from IMO for this important presentation he made. I will not take too long. The main priority, as I said, international institutions, political leaders are aware. They have understood the need to focus on ratification of convention or implementation of environmental protection for our continent. And we really want, through the African Union member states, to encourage all the member states who have not joined any specific ratification or conventions to join us. And in the name of the acting director, I really want to extend the same to Madam Lydia, that we will be there to support in terms of lobbying, in terms of advocacy. So you can count into our side. At the final stage, where are we today? At the African Union Commission, through the Department of Blue Economy, we have developed what we call Africa Blue Economy Strategy. That strategy was built with the view to protect our seas and oceans. But when COVID-19 came up, we did not finalize the next stage of this strategy, which was to focus on decarbonization. And since last month, we have decided to put in place a joint strategic task force among different departments to defend this specific cause, which is responsible for damages of infrastructure in the continent. The recent condition from Mauritius, we do remember what was happening in this country in terms of fuel, and we want really to protect our seas and oceans for the future of our continent. Thank you so much, and submit to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raisa. Just also a remark from your presentation, it is very clear that as a continent, we should not be left behind in mitigating climate change in form of pollution, emissions, and of life of ships, oil spills, and all that. So we welcome any question from the members. Any question, remark? There is one here from Mariam Kidere. Are there policies on implementation of MARPOL Annex VI in place to ensure equal implementation by all African member states? That is a question directed to Dr. Raisa. Are there policies on implementation of MARPOL Annex VI in place to ensure equal implementation by all African member states?
The MARPOL, can I take the floor, Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor, Chair. The MARPOL Convention is a specific document from IMO, but as African Union Commission, we will support definitely if there is any call-up from their side, but even through the MTCC Africa. Submit to you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, we can now go to the third and the last presentation. I now take this opportunity to welcome Mrs. Lydia Ngugi, International Maritime Lawyer, Project Head, Maritime Technology Cooperative Center, Africa. Welcome, Madam Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just start by sharing my presentation as I request Dr. Raisa. She has stopped sharing. Okay, now I will start sharing my presentation. And this is the title of my presentation, from an MTCC Africa perspective, looking at it from the regional perspective, definitely on the policy and legal aspects in the African region, on the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI. And some of the contents The contents of my presentation includes what is the future of energy efficiency and port development in the African region. This is very important because we note that in the African region, we are more inclined towards port development as opposed to ship ownership. And these are some of the aspects that we will look into. What do we need to consider when we are looking into policies as IMO member states relevant to energy efficiency? The second aspect will be on the port governance structures, and this is through the policy reviews that need to be considered, as well as the initial IMO GHG strategy. What context of the broader measures does it fall under? The principles guiding the IMO initial GHG strategy. What are the impacts on the states and the challenges and the barriers that are in place when we are implementing the same? Now, first and foremost, we are definitely looking at a very progressive future, and as well, we are looking at this from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Development Goal number 13 and number 14 and number 17 as well are looking towards. 13 is looking at climate change, 14 is looking at the ocean aspect, 17 is looking at the partnerships aspect, as well as the other United Nations Sustainable Goals. They all mirror each other. And to this effect, when we are at the future of energy efficiency and port development in the African region, it is important to note that there is need to have it as sustainable, there is need to have it as resilient, there is need to have it as renewable, and most importantly, there is need to have it as digital. A good example is the single window, which is an implementation of the FAL Convention from the International Maritime Organization. When we look at it from the port governance perspective as African maritime states, what constitutes functional measures of a port under which green port developments need to be considered? And this basically brings full circle the role of a port. We have the regulatory and the planning authority, which works very closely as well with the maritime authorities. We have the element of the protection of environment. We have the energy supply, elements that look into vessel traffic management, the turnaround times, and the provisional infrastructure, looking at it from ports that are looking to move towards solar energy, ports that are looking to move towards cold ironing stroke shore power, as well as other lighting effects in the ports and use of machineries that do not at the end of the day pollute the environment. And this definitely puts into perspective the mitigation of climate change in the shipping and maritime industry. So in this respect, we have the African continent. And I remember last week, Madam Nancy mentioned that the African continent during the IMO UNEP during the IMO UNEP function that was held last week in the forum, virtual forum, she mentioned that the African continent is an island continent. It is an island continent because you can see it is solidly placed, bordering vast international ocean space. And looking at the ocean space, we definitely ensure that we are, as MTCC Africa, championing and looking to promote sustainable development to mitigate the effects of climate change. How do we do this? Through the practical implementation of MARPOL Annex VI, through our pilot projects, as well as having forums like this that encourage the ratification and the domestication of the MARPOL Convention Annex VI. And this definitely looks into some of the challenges that which will be experienced by member states, and also some of the barriers that will be experienced by member states. Not only looking at the challenges, we're also looking at some of the positive pointers that need to be factored in by the policy experts, the legal experts who work very closely with the technical teams in the respective ports and the maritime administrations, who in turn ensure that the private sector, and that is the shipping lines and the shipbuilding regions, are definitely in the right direction. Therefore, the initial IMO GHG strategy has a broader perspective, and this broader perspective from the regal realm puts into focus the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is the mother convention that looks into these elements. There are specific articles that are looking into elements of the marine environment. For example, articles 192 all the way to articles 194. And this works very closely with the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, that is the Paris Agreement. And these relevant international conventions definitely give a leading role for development and adoption in the assistance of implementation of environmental regulations applicable to international shipping. Two things to consider when we are looking at it from an energy efficiency perspective. Number one, in the African region, it mostly borders to port development. Number two, it mostly borders into having policies that promote port development. And number three, ports are owned by the government. Therefore, it has to border towards creating revenue for the respective government, whilst at the same time promoting energy efficiency. So how is this done? This is through, as highlighted earlier, consideration of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as working very closely with the International Maritime Organization as IMO member states during the MEPC deliberations. From the time that we have the studies being discussed in the relevant working groups, states are encouraged to ensure that they voice out their concerns in terms of what they need to consider and some of the challenges that they experience in the policy formulation processes. What are the principles and the guidance that looks into this through the initial IMO GHG strategy? First and foremost, it's very important to note that there is the principle of non-discrimination and the principle of no more favorable treatment enshrined in the MARPOL Convention, as well as other IMO convention. And this definitely means that it is surely not business as usual. The African continent needs to work very closely and steadfastly towards energy efficiency. However, it is very important to note that we also need to put into consideration and be fully aware of the ramifications and the borders that are within the principle of the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. This basically means that countries from the developing states will not be put on the same benchmark as countries from the developed regions. Therefore, it is important to have a strategy looking at the short-term candidate measures, the mid-term candidate measures, and the long-term candidate measures of the IMO GHG strategy as to how this approach can be brought on board. One such like measure that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities can be implemented by legal departments in the ports authorities and the maritime or administrations in the African region is to ensure that they have expressed in the respective MEPC discussions the need to have support from the International Maritime Organization in elements of energy efficiency, especially port development through the aspects of cold ironing and or solar energies at the ports. The principles as well that give us this guidance are to ensure that all ships give full and complete effect regardless of the implementation of mandatory measures. In addition to this, there is need to ensure that the impact of measures on states, including developing countries, are in line with the specific MEPC papers that have been highlighted above. And these papers will be available on our website in the resource link that will be having the section of this webinar. In addition to this, it is very important for the African member states of IMO and the African Union as well to have evidence-based decision-making. This is closely linked to public policy in evidence with the precautionary approach that was highlighted by Ivane during his presentation. And this will ideally lead to the sustainability of the ports, at the same time ensuring that they are in full compliance of the measures that have been highlighted under the Paris Agreement. Now, when we are putting the policy in line with the MARPOL Convention Annex VI into perspective, what are some of the factors that need to be considered? Some of the key factors that the strategy highlights that need to be considered include the geographic remoteness of and connectivity to main markets. This predominantly means that given the geographic position of the ports, the Ports Authority working closely with the Maritime Authority need to assess whether this will be a plus or a minus based on the respective gross domestic product of the respective country. At the same time, there is need to put into consideration the cargo value that goes through the port and the cargo type, looking at it from the transport costs, how it will affect the food security of the country, that is the wider aspects of the United Nations Sustainable Goals. What are some of the disaster responses that need to be put on board as a mitigation of risk measure from the respective ports? What is the cost effectiveness, and is there a socio-economic progress development, or will it stagnate? Basically, at the end of the day, the policy needs to ensure that the ports will have energy efficiency measures that are demand-driven. Having demand-driven energy measures will as well generate the revenue for the ports, and at the same time create functionalities of employment to the port workers through sustainability. And much as this is the case, what are some of the challenges and the barriers in the implementation? Number one, we have the element of the financial risks. As we are all aware, the maritime industry is a very high risk, high return. When we look at the element of port development, it is definitely as well high risk, high return. Why is it a high risk, high return? When you delve deeper into the energy efficiency aspects in the convention and reading it closely with the initial IMO GHG strategy, you will realize that energy efficiency complete implementation may take up to more than 10 years for full implementation. And this doesn't mean that countries have started. Other countries are looking at a pilot phase, implementation of a pilot phase. Other countries are looking at how do we even start the thinking process of working towards the implementation phase. So these are some of the financial risks that are coming along. The other one is having a short-term plan as a safety net. Having a short-term plan as a safety net doesn't entirely give you the full picture of what we will be looking into when we are working towards the net zero by 2050. Therefore, it is important for the member states to ensure that their policy has a short-term plan, a mid-term plan, and a long-term plan. And all of these have to be aligned to the measures in the respective jurisdiction. One common example that most ports are definitely looking into is to how to reduce the consumption of energy. There has been a great push towards the use of solar energy. And in our recently concluded energy efficiency conference that we held as MTCC Africa in the month of March of 2021, we noted as part of our recommendation that there are few and far in between companies that are owned and or even led by a shareholder majority by indigenous Africans. Therefore, it is important for the region to look towards having this aspect because it is an enabling manner to bring on board sustainability and at the same time building on energy efficiency. The other measure that the policy in the respective maritime states needs to put into consideration is to ensure that they have mitigated the lack of direct control over operations. How do you mitigate this? This is done by ensuring that there is enough capacity building of the technical officers and of the resource persons. One way is to have this again voiced out at the MEPC, that is the Marine Environmental Protection Committee meetings. MTCC Africa is also in a position to ensure that there is expertise advice that is availed to the respective ports, as well as the respective regions in the port consideration aspect. And the other factor that definitely needs to be put into consideration in the policy that implements the MARPOL Annex VI is to ensure that there is no lack of appropriate cost-benefit analysis. This is definitely a financial term, and of late, there has been a push towards having the bankable maritime port efficiency projects. What is a bankable maritime port efficiency project? This basically means that the respective port has to have an implementation phase of a pilot project. And once they have tangible recommendations, the said recommendations can be made into a proposal and handed over to respective development banks in the region or the respective countries. We have on board the World Bank, and we also have on board the European Bank of Development, as well as the African Development Bank, who work closely with other intermediary banks to see how ports at the end of the day can have a direct return on investment based on energy efficiency that at the end of the day will lead to the net zero campaign that the African region has to champion towards. And some of the other barriers that need to be put into consideration are with regards to charter contracts. And this is definitely brought on board through some of the experiences that we have had when we are going through the pilot projects as MTCC Africa. First and foremost, we have the first two pilot projects that we had completed in the year 2019-2020. However, as of this year, we have the pilot project known as the quantification of emissions within the port limits of Mombasa. Now, one of the challenges that we have with implementation of such a pilot project is that you may find a vessel is on a time charter. And when a vessel is on a time charter, they're definitely working with time, speed, and money. And these are some of the aspects that shippers need to sit around in the round table during our regional industry alliance for them to be able to understand that at the end of the day, there is definitely need to work together and as stakeholders ensure that we are working towards the same goal. And this is the end of my presentation. I welcome any questions and comments that may be brought on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Lydia. We had some follow-up questions for Dr. Raisa, and I believe she's answered one, and there's one from Dr. Denya. What is being done to sensitize the African state about African blue economy? And another one was from Michael Mbaru. The EU issues several directives on emission reduction from ships, which ensure uniform implementation by its members. Are there any efforts from EU towards a regional regulatory approach to ship emission reduction? Is Dr. Raisa still around? No, she's, yeah. Or maybe Lydia, can you take any of the questions?
Thank you. I will start with the last question, which is, are there measures from the African Union, from Africa Union towards MARPOL Convention? Well, I am aware that through the presentation that Dr. Raisa gave, that there is the African Blue Economy Strategy Committee, and this committee comprises of member states of the respective maritime transport departments. Therefore, we encourage the states who are present here to be part of that committee. As well, we have the MTCC Africa, which is working very closely with the International Maritime Organization. We have a very vibrant regional focal point group, and of late we have been in great communication in the group. Therefore, if there is need to have some deeper discussion, please reach out to us with the respective comment and respective policy issue that you're looking into, and this will be factored in to see how best the capacity can be built and how best energy efficiency can be promoted in the region as well. I would also highlight that through the pilot projects that MTCC Africa has been working on, We have the respective FAST2 reports on our website, and the current pilot project, which is the quantification of emissions within the port limits of Mombasa. The recommendations will be availed to the entire member state category of MTCC Africa, and member states will be able to benefit to see how they can move forward with the elements of energy efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Lydia. And also there was also one follow-up question for our first presenter, Mr. Ivane. It was about, in your practice as a lawyer, what have you come across being the challenges that are being faced during the implementation and the domestication of this convention, the Annex MARPOL 6?
Thank you very much. And with regard to what we have experienced at MTCC Africa, one of the main challenges is that different states have different needs. And that is why there is a slow uptake towards the ratification of the MARPOL Annex VI, because some states are looking more towards, without naming other aspects, they're looking towards most important aspects in their respective practical regions, and elements of ratification of climate change, because it's being perceived as invisible, does not have the quick uptick. Therefore, MTCC Africa encourages states to consider this as a matter of sustainable development consideration. And one of the ways that we are looking into championing this is through the energy efficiency mitigation measures. For example, at the ports, most currently states are using electricity to power their respective buildings and infrastructure. But there are options like use of solar panels. There are other options like having the cold ironing and shore power on board. They may be expensive, but at the end of the day, when you bring on board mechanisms that go full circle, for example, I will give one practical example. We have the example of the just-in-time vessel alignment. Once states bring on board the just-in-time vessel alignment, which is where vessels switch off their engines and the slow steam into the port, assuming that the said port has at the same time implemented the cold ironing shore power aspect, which is considered a bit of an expensive investment. There can be reduction measures in terms of fees that are paid by shipping lines that are looking into the just-in-time, such that they get a discount when they are bringing on board and using the respective cold ironing facility. So they get to save, and at the same time, the port gets to earn more revenue. The other example is the use of the solar panels. And we have this example at the port of Mombasa, and other ports are slowly catching up. I wouldn't say slowly catching up, but other ports are catching up. And use of solar panels definitely decreases electricity. So the electricity bills are reduced, and at the same time, solar is 24 hours. So you get to save, and you get to, of course, promote energy efficiency in the ports. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Madam Lydia. There are two more questions for you. One is from Mufsade from Morocco. He's asking, did you take into account the impacts of COVID-19 in strategy you have just presented? And then the second one is from Joachim. Is AU providing MTCC Africa any form of support to encourage African countries to accede or to ratify the MARPOL Annex VI Convention? Those two.
Thank you. So I'll start with the last question. Is African Union or European Union?
African Union.
Okay, when it comes to the African Union, we are still in deliberations to have the training facility implemented to the entire African representation at the African Union. So we are having ongoing discussions to make sure that all countries benefit. And from the International Maritime Organization, we have on board the the sister project, which is known as the Green Voyage, whereby Kenya is a pilot country, and being a pilot country, we will be able to train the entire African region, if not all the African maritime states, on how to bring on board energy efficiency through relevant policies. The other element is whether we factored in the delays that have been brought about by COVID-19. Yes, this is sadly a world over problem, and especially given the fact that we have also been having the elements of crew change, which were affected during the onset of the convention. There were delays that have been noted, and respective member states have been highlighting this at the MEPC, at the IMO. There is an upcoming MEPC in the month of November, and these are some of the aspects that will be highlighted as to how the COVID pandemic has affected the implementation of MARPOL Annex VI, as well as the initial IMO GHG strategy. Thank you.
Yes, there's also another one also for Lydia. On pilot from Kenneth Kagoya, on pilot projects, what is the scope in terms of technologies and also requirement for a proposal to be piloted under MTC or IMO funding and get IMO funding?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. And in terms of the scope that our pilot projects looks into, we have currently, similar to the previous question, been hampered by the COVID pandemic. Therefore, we look at a scope that is definitely very effective. And one of the ways that the scope has to be effective is to ensure that the shipping lines that we work with are represented in the entire African region. Much as we cannot, as MTCC Africa experts, move freely around the region due to the limitations of travel in some states, the shipping lines which are working and docking at the ports of Mombasa are well able to have that advantage. And through the respective ports, those are the scopes that we look at. The other part of the question is what constitutes the identification of the pilot project. Well, with the identification of the pilot project, we work very closely with the International Maritime Organization, as well as the deliberations that are held at the MEPC, and the representatives who sit at the MEPC from the line ministries and the maritime authorities are able to earmark some of the most important key elements that they need to consider. For example, in the developing countries region, like Africa, there has been a great push towards energy efficiency at the ports by the sole reason that the elements of ship ownership in the region are not so pronounced. Therefore, we lean towards what is more prominent and what brings more revenue to the country. And that is how we earmark some of the pilot projects that we are benchmarking with. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Lydia. There's also another one here from Tamale from Maputo. Is there a possibility of a port with private management benefiting from funding from World Bank or other international funding source in order to carry out an energy efficiency project in the port without funding being via a government institution?
Thank you. And I note that he said the port ought to be private first. It ought to be
Yes.
a private port.
Yes.
So once it is a private port, I am aware that in West Africa, there are some states that have private ports and they have been funded by developed countries. However, this means that this respective developed country is working very closely with the developed country, the developed and the developing are working very closely, thus they have a way of sharing the profits. This is one way to go about this, and they can definitely bring on board an international financing institution, have the respective parameters in the legal contracting capabilities to see how this can be of benefit. However, I would advise for states to consider the public-private partnership. In the public-private partnership, it means that it will be like a hall of mirrors. There will be vast elements to consider given this representation, but at the end of the day, there will be sustainable development for even the port workers who are working within the ports, who will also be considered government officials and workers for sustainability of their livelihoods as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Lydia. We have a remark here from Frederick Samba. Good job, MTCC Africa, for building the capacity to address climate change in the shipping industry in the continent. So right now, we'll go for a short break. And the main reason of the break is to fill the survey of evaluation form that had been shared, but I'm going also to share it again before we have our closing remarks. So we'll go for a short break for 5 minutes. If there is no any other question, it's already been shared. You can go ahead and fill the form, and we'll get the feedback. Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience and cooperation. Thank you also. I've seen one participant has asked whether it can be shared through the email because they cannot open. I believe that will be done. Now let me invite Madam Lydia to give her closing remarks. Welcome, Madam Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gerald, for this great job that you have done as the system moderator for this particular meeting. I must give my appreciation for this admirable task that you have taken up seamlessly. I must highlight that Dr. Gerald is one of our MTCC Africa experts on the pilot project that is the quantification of emissions within port limits. Thank you very much, Gerald, for the excellent timekeeping as well. This is much appreciated. I would also want to appreciate Madam Nancy Karigidhu. Madam Nancy Karigidhu is the Principal Secretary, Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure, Housing and Urban Development and Public Works from the State Department for Shipping and Maritime. We definitely took note of the fact that you highlighted in your speech that MARPOL Annex VI was developed to control the worldwide concern on air pollution, as well as promoting the Agenda 2050 on Africa's integrated maritime strategy. And this is very important because it encourages member states to ratify and domesticate the implementation of international legal instruments like the MARPOL Annex VI. In addition to this, I would like to thank Mr. Ivane Abashidze, who had to leave due to a pre-planned engagement. Mr. Ivane is the Deputy Director, Maritime Transport Agency in Georgia, Batumi, and he is also the Vice Chair of the International Maritime Organization Legal Committee. In his presentation, we definitely are appreciative of the fact that he highlighted that the flag state can incentivize the use of the EEED, as well as the note that he made that member states are audited by the IMO, looking at the elements of concrete approach in design for new built ships. Thank you very much, Mr. Ivane, for this very informative presentation that you gave us. I now also would like to appreciate Dr. Raisa Ada Alogo, who is the senior policy officer, pardon me. She is the senior policy officer in the Department of the Infrastructure and Energy at the African Union Commission based in Addis Ababa. We definitely took note of the points that you gave us that critically highlighted that climate change on infrastructure has caused intensive infrastructural damage and has accelerating the aging of some ships and assets in the maritime space. We also took note of the elements that you highlighted that proved to show that Africa needs to be part of the progressive change towards climate change mitigation in the shipping and maritime industry. We are very honored and humbled to have such an experienced panel that was present in this webinar. I would also like to thank the participants who have been very engaging, the participants who have been giving us very good feedback. We can see even in some of the chat functions. We shall definitely get back to you on some of the personal questions that you have sent through MTCC Africa. And I would also lastly like to appreciate the MTCC Africa Secretariat. I want to appreciate Ruth, who is the administrator, and Musa, who is the ICT, who have worked round the clock to ensure that this meeting, much as it is held virtually, is a success, and also to ensure that we have kept time, if not saved time. So we are definitely looking towards energy efficiency as being the MTCC Africa Secretariat. So thank you very much, participants. I must highlight that there was a slide that was shared during the evaluation questionnaire, and the slide highlighted that we are welcoming member states officials from the ports authorities, from the maritime authorities in the region, to be part of our MTCC Africa Focal Point Committee. We do not want to leave any state behind, and this is important because we have monthly meetings with the respective MTCC Africa Focal Point countries. We may have had a bit of a gap due to the extensive meetings we have been having, but we always find a way of keeping in touch, albeit virtually. Thus, write to us at MTCC Africa at jkwat.ac.ke. The next meeting will be highlighted to your respective email addresses. We shall be looking at interesting elements that the region should look forward to implementing in the respective maritime space. And with this, I want to again appreciate every one of you who has been part of this, very informative meeting. And feel free to leave at your leisure. If you have any comment to make, please write to us in the chat function. We shall still be online for a few minutes, and we can also correspond through the email address. Thank you very much.